David?
I agree with Erik. I think that's an excellent point about the changing conceptions of governance and the relationship between territory, defending territory, because it also gets into what we were talking about this morning with security and how security shifted from a territorial defense-based security where all NATO allies, including Iceland, which didn't really have a military but had a strategic value because of its geography, and it's to how it shifted over time, and that's created new challenges for these institutions. And I think what we're all sort of looking at here is the central question, and that is, how do we introduce flexibility to solve or manage transnational problems without breaking the institutions of what we got? Because we know we don't want to, it's almost like an insurance element to it. We don't want to immediately just sort of get rid of it. We want to adapt it and improve it. But we also know that alone it's not enough. And just two examples, and I know there's no magic bullet to that. I'm a little bit hesitant to suggest a new institution at a transatlantic level. I know there were some discussions in the 1950s. I remember reading articles in International Organization about it, of the Atlantic Union, the Atlantic Community, and things like that. And they resurrect at different times. With the whole smallpox, it was basically a network of physicians and medical specialists who almost had like default, like blanket overflight rights, so that if there was a problem, they could respond. In the 2004 tsunami, the response and international leaders were credited with a very quick response to the recovery of that. There was no big G8 summit. There was no great WTO meeting. There was no European Council meeting. It was basically a number of, it's like the Deputy Secretary of State and a few other leaders in other parts got on a big conference call and said, we have a problem. What can we do to solve it? What can we do? Who can bring what to bear? And it was done.
Yeah.
And maybe that will be useful in some cases. Big institutional elements will be useful in other cases. So the key, I think, will be to try to find a good mix. And that's the challenge for us all.
Klaus?
I fully agree with your point that we should not create new institutions right now. For one simple reason, the situation is by far too volatile, too much in flux to think through and to negotiate a new institution. It would be a dangerous proposition. When I mentioned early on this triangular configuration, I did not think of a new institution. I thought of cooperation of existing institutions under perhaps a charter which organizes just the mode of cooperation, nothing else.
I mean, to jump in, isn't there, to tie these 2 points together, isn't there a political point where if we slaughter, and I'll use the American example because it's easier, if we slaughter 2 sacred cows, we actually have a decision-making tree that I think does this. If you can get former Republican unilateralists to say, yes, I accept that in theory, full institutional agreement is best. If we can get the UN Security Council to act, we'll do it. We will make a good faith effort, knowing full well that that might not happen 85% of the time. But then you get Democrats who believe in pure multilateralism, and if you don't do it that way, you do nothing. To say, well, then if not within this, we have the CJTF plus model. We have people not vetoing, but the people who want to go along, kind of getting things done. With that within the rubric of the institution. And then if
are you talking of CJTF?
Well, you take the notion of a combined joint task force, as you know, sir, and you say, okay, I'm not going to get in your way, but I'm not really going to contribute, and I'm not going to badmouth it. Then we'll do it within the institution, a NATO-type mission. Then if that doesn't work, you do Claude Range. You round up the usual suspects, David, as you said, for your thing. And then and only then do you hit to a unilateralism if it's a pressing matter of war and peace, so almost never. You know, it seems to me that you could bring along 65 to 75% of the people out there around that very workmanlike approach. You then have the institution preserved, but then you have the flexibility within that system as well. And politically, I think it works. Now, there are going to be 25% who hate this. But if we get 75 along, it would preserve this institutional integrity we're looking for, but provide us with the flexibility to get things done. Does anybody want to jump on that, yes or no? Thomas.
Really quick, I mean, the obvious response is, why would you need the institutions then? If you can have simply coalitions of the willing working together on a basis. I'm actually with you, John. I think that's a model that to me has a lot of appeal, and I think that you still need the institutions because at the end of the day, when you look at what makes joint military action possible, it isn't the fact that the United States calls Downing Street 10. It's also the fact that the militaries know how to cooperate, that they have the few nozzles on the Hungarian airbase fit into a Dutch F-16. You need the institutions, I think, to continue building the groundwork, to come up with the standards, to be talking about what would probably the responses be, to also ideally, and this is a pet peeve of mine in security terms, I want our institutions to be doing a lot more of the horizon scanning and the crisis management, which I think we have gotten a little bit out of a habit of. We've talked a lot about the need for crisis management and horizon scanning and early warning in economic terms, looking at your spreads, and when we haven't talked enough about looking at horizon scanning in security terms. We're continuously taken aback and surprised by Libya's Arab Springs, and I don't think we spend enough time as a military alliance looking at it ourselves. But at the end of the day, I think that, John, the sort of a flexible arrangement you described makes a lot of sense. It could and must coexist with the institutions, because you need the institutions to do you're talking through the possible responses, looking at the possible threats out there, standardization, building up habits of cooperation. You need to know who to call. You need to have the Rolodexes. You need to have the relationships. You need to know how to make the pitch. You need to know that when the person on the other end picks up the phone, and his son's grumpy, it's nothing personal. And it's these things only come from interactions, from cooperation. Right. That's what you need the institutions for, alongside the sort of flexible arrangements that you described.
Erik?
Just real quick, I agree with you completely, and in the European Union context, that was called the Luxembourg Compromise. People badmouth unanimity, but the fact is when it's unanimous decision making, you're allowed to abstain without counting against the majority. And so countries would do that regularly. They would just abstain, and that allowed them to allow progress to go on, even if they disagreed. Whereas in qualified majority voting, you have to take a public position, and your public position then results in political controversy. Now, I say that works well, but the problem is that there are always bad actors who want to come in and take advantage of the system. So you establish a framework within which this kind of cooperation can take place, and then some country or another decides to pull their instruments out of it. Greece would be a great example in the context of NATO, or Turkey in the context of the NATO-EU relationship. So I think we have to be robust enough to deal with these implicit veto players if we're going to go down the route that you suggest.
But if we are, and just to follow up something you said, and I'd like all your view on that, we have to accept also, humility was mentioned this morning, that some of these problems we're not going to solve. There are going to be times we don't act together, and the answer is no. In this new world, there's just going to be, for this complexity point you're bringing up. But this allows, given that you get the 75, 85% thing, you're going to lose the 15. I mean, taking in the Greek Cypriots, I remember this, and what a nightmare this, and gamed out what a disaster this was one afternoon. And the Greek Cypriot ambassador said, of course I'm going to cause trouble. I'm in now. I can do whatever I want. And I said, does no one in Brussels talk to you? I mean, evidently no. But I understand that the actor can still gum up the system fundamentally. If Turkey under Erdogan wants to play the bullshit card, they can. But if we make it, if we do this, we're going to win more than we lose, and that will restore credibility, and that will make our democratic people say, it's kind of worth a little bit of money we throw to NATO to have them meet, and I see the value, without us having to make arguments. It'll work, and if it works, people will know that. But no, it won't be perfect. Of course not.
No, what you do is you reduce the risk that a spoiler spoils the will of the majority.
Yeah.
So actually, to that extent, it is a more democratic way. But I also think it's a way to. I mean, we've talked about the need for flexible arrangements, and I think the way you put it, of introducing flexibility to solve transnational problems without breaking the institutions, is the one-liner to take away from this conference. It's how do you build these flexible arrangements and avoid that it becomes possible for sort of rogue allies or spoiler allies or spoiler states to manipulate the system and stand in the way of solving some of these problems.